Hello, everyone. I'm Uli Volz. I'm one of the co-chairs of this task force, along with Paola Subacci and Tetsushi Sonobe. And Paola was supposed to kick us off, but her flight came in late, so we'll have to get started without her. Unfortunately, the first part of the presentation was hers, so I'll try to manage that. And forgive me if the presentation is not as lucid as it would have been if Paola had given it. But so the plan for this session is that the three co-chairs will first give an overview of what the task force has been doing and highlight some of the major recommendations. Obviously, we could each talk for hours about each of the areas we're going to cover, but this is not possible. So I'll just, or we will just highlight the key issues, and then hopefully we'll manage to do that within 15 to 20 minutes. And then we have the remaining time for comments and discussion. So let me get started with Paola's presentation. So we have three work streams, and the first one is looking at keeping the world economy on track and addressing both the short-term emergencies, but also making sure that we're pursuing the long-term objectives. Next slide, please. As you all know, we've been in a pandemic for 2 years, so the situation was dramatic enough already. But it has become even more difficult to handle now. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has, of course, caused all sorts of additional problems. So before the war started, we were looking at how to support sustainable economic recoveries, not just economic recoveries, but sustainable economic recoveries. At the same time, how can we make sure that we contain inflationary pressures and deal with the growing debt problems, including sovereign debt problems? How can we make sure that growing fiscal demands due to the goal of decarbonizations are met with fiscal sustainability challenges? And of course, also how to deal with cross-boundary spillovers, and while also managing long-term challenges like global demographic change. And now with the war, we have the rocketing of energy prices, food prices, which is going to be a massive problem, especially for developing countries where really new famines are feared for now. And of course, all the discussions around global economic cooperation are also now taking place against the backdrop of the heightened geopolitical risks that we face. Next slide, please. So Paola's work stream, and I see Paola has joined actually. Paola, I don't know if you are already ready to go and take over here. Or I'll just continue and hope that you jump in when you can. So Paola's work stream has put forward several proposals. First, of course, with the aim of keeping the world economy on track, but very much strengthening international cooperation in 4 areas. Making sure that aggregate demand is strengthened at the national and global level, that global macroeconomic imbalances are being addressed, and that also we have a sustainable system of worldwide lending between countries, and all that while keeping the global trading system open. Next slide, please. And there are a number of critical policy areas, of course, monetary policy, fiscal policy, the management of international capital flows, especially with a view to managing the global energy transition, there is a big challenge regarding the debt situation in low-income countries, and I'll talk a bit about that when I come to my own work stream, strengthening the multilateral trading system and strengthening global supply chains, and the risks of these have been very much highlighted through the recent crises, and also getting better regulatory policies and policy cooperation. Paola, are you ready to take over?
Yes, I'm ready to take over, but I really don't understand how this works. This session, it doesn't make sense to me because I don't know where we are. I don't know where you are, Oli, and it doesn't seem to make sense. I'm in a room with other people whose sense very, very silent. I don't know. Sorry, I just arrived from London. I don't think it made any sense for me to be here today. I feel very frustrated because my flight was late, and the whole thing is a bit ridiculous. But anyway, I see also David, who actually contributed. We worked together on this paper, and I think Uli, you already gave a quite overview of the paper and where I think you introduced the challenges then we are facing. And I think we are now on the slides on action needed. And our thinking here is we need to really separate the short-term challenges of rescuing, if you like, or keeping the global recovery on track, given the current crisis. And so we focus on the policy areas, and in particularly on the action needed in terms of fiscal policies and monetary policies, and also aid support to low-income countries. And then in the long term, we look at what we call, is a way to think in terms of cooperation and what we call a new global bargain. So if you go back to the previous slide, Uli, if you don't mind, or whoever is maneuvering this presentation. So in the short term, the fiscal policy really should be focused on short-term income support, focus on households and they need to be supported given the increase in prices, especially for energy and food. And again, I think, and again, on monetary policy, we had a long discussion here. And we come to the conclusion that monetary policy should actually do whatever it takes to stabilize prices and to avoid then inflation expectation getting ingrained. And then, while at the same time, they need to, with the action of normalization on policy interest rates should continue. But obviously, there are these two dimensions. They are not necessarily going in sync at the moment. And again, the importance of keeping the inflation on track. And again, to avoid and the inflation becomes, let's say, structural, then it takes priority over these medium-term normalization of interest rate. And again, we made some proposal here for the aid and relief in terms of, again, just these are two possibilities, and we can become more innovative here. But one is a new contingent facility to help countries which feel very directly the impact of the current emergency. And we focus here in particular on the Black Sea Rim and North Africa. You probably know that Egypt has gone through a third package of relief from the IMF. And then again, we suggested some export credits program for countries that feel they terms of trade have deteriorated. But if you go, Uli, if you don't mind to move to the next slide, if you know the international policy cooperation. So again, we focus on this new, the need to design and implement a macroeconomic policy that manages and minimize the risk in the global financial system and in climate and in the global health system. So again, we need to think of this macroeconomic policy, which is not only fiscal or not only monetary, but it's an integrated policy. And also we suggest then along this first point on macroeconomic policy, we suggest then the G7 should spearhead a new global bargain. And again, we refer here consciously and carefully to Bretton Woods in 1994 and obviously the birth of the United Nations in 1945. Carefully and consciously, I say, because we do not want to go through another discussion of do we need another Bretton Woods, because that's not the point. But what we need is a new global bargain. And this global bargain should support long-term economic growth, which remains a critical issue for the G7 and the G20. So again, strong, balanced, sustainable and inclusive growth. We need to tackle this global bargain, need to tackle the energy transition and the decarbonization of the economy. And again, the current crisis provides yet another opportunity to think how to go through this energy transition, decarbonization, how to coordinate policy action in order to minimize the impact of negative externalities. And then we need to strengthen the governance of the international financial architecture. And Uli, if you go to the next slide, I'd like to really focus on this particular point on the multilateral financial architecture. We know there are many ways to strengthen the governance, and some of these many aspects are long overdue. But we focus here on two aspects in particular. One is the multilateral framework for international debt restructuring, an old story, and it's been back and forth for years, and yet we haven't done anything in terms of creating this multilateral framework, and now is more needed than ever. And the other point on governance is the governance of international sanctions. So we accept that sanctions are necessary to curb rule breaking, but also we are aware that we need some governance to avoid then sanctions become a weapon for settling tension and dispute with between countries. So while they are an effective instrument, they need to stay as an effective instrument as the last resort, the instrument of last resort, and their governance need to be actually not even rethink, to be put together in a strong framework. And again, I conclude that I don't need to mention then recently, particularly under the Trump administration, there was a big escalation in the so-called weaponization of the dollar. And again, this is a point that need to be taken into account by the G7. Once we have an international monetary system, they use the dollar, which is national currency, but we need to think how we structure the governance of this system in order to avoid that some countries feel more compelled to move to a different path and different type of infrastructure in order to avoid to be trapped into indiscriminate and arbitrary sanctions down in the future. And for these 2 points, we suggest to establish international commissions to take stakeholder views and also take stock of the existing research. And that's it from the workstream 1. Thank you.
Thank you. And I take over with workstream 2. So where we've been working on 2 policy briefs, one on scaling up sustainable finance to enable sustainable economic recoveries, and second one on addressing the debt crisis in the global south, which is also a very important topic for the G7. Next slide, please. So on the scaling up sustainable finance, when we talk about sustainable recoveries, obviously we need a lot of investment, and this investment all has to be sustainable. And there has been a very intensive discussion over the last couple of years how to align the financial system with sustainability. And in the COVID recovery efforts, it will be of utmost importance to really mainstream sustainability approaches across the financial system, so that all lending and investment really take sustainability criteria, including environmental, social criteria, sufficiently into account. And so we have a list of 10 different policy recommendations for scaling up sustainable finance. I won't have time to go into great detail into any of them, but a starting point is that the G7 should intensify efforts to develop, align, and implement science-based sustainable finance taxonomies. There are lots of things happening in this place already, including the Common Ground taxonomy, where the EU has been involved, and these need to be intensified. Second, it's absolutely crucial to make disclosures of climate-related risks and opportunities mandatory for all large companies and also for all financial institutions, in line with the TCFD recommendations. The UK has already done that, and all other G7 countries need to move ahead with that, and this should then prospectively also be extended to nature-related risks, as the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures will present its recommendations next year. Third, can you go back, please? Third, it will be important that financial institutions lay out a very clear pathway how to achieve net zero, and for this, the recommendation is to make net zero transition plans mandatory, again, for all large companies and for all financial institutions. Likewise, stress testing has to become standard and mandatory. And can someone please mute themselves, because there is a lot of sound now? Yeah, thank you. So stress testing also has to become mandatory for all financial institutions, and all G7 central banks and supervisors need to conduct regular climate stress tests for the financial system and the macroeconomy at large. Next slide, please. It will be then also important to develop prudential frameworks which should be adjusted for climate and other sustainability-related risks. And one example would be addressing capital requirements to reflect stranded asset risk and other risks sufficiently. Central banks and also other public financial institutions, including also international financial institutions, should decarbonize their portfolios and also put forward very clear net zero transition plans. A very important area is using or harnessing the potential of digital finance to scale up sustainable finance and investment. And this can be also combined with efforts to strengthen domestic resource mobilization. And this relates both to micro, small, medium enterprises, but also to infrastructure financing, and also household finance and insurance. G7 governments should promote and indeed issue themselves sustainability-linked and just transition bonds. Another area which has huge potential is exploring the opportunities for having more public development banks, green banks, to invest in SDGs. Some G7 countries already have these banks, but given the need to massively ramp up sustainable finance, there's much scope, and there are some very positive examples in that field. And then last but not least, there is also an important role for the G7 at the international level in ramping up sustainable finance, sustainable investment in developing emerging economies through their influence at the major international financial institutions. So sorry, I've been rushing through that. It's a quite comprehensive list, and each point would merit in a presentation of its own, but time is short. Next slide, please. A topic that is of utmost importance as well is there has been so much discussion around building back better and sustainable recoveries and so on. But as a matter of fact, a lot of countries in the global south have severe debt problems and have no fiscal space really for investing in sustainability and in recoveries. And this needs to be addressed. The G7 countries, not only in part, important creditors. More importantly, they are hosting many of the private sector creditors, which are holding the majority of sovereign debt from global south. And again, there are quite a number of different proposals, and I'll just be able to rush through. First is absolutely crucial, increasing transparency of public and private sovereign debt to both creditors and debtors. There are some good initiatives going on, but they need much more effort to speed this up. When we talk about debt sustainability, it's crucial that we get debt sustainability analysis right. The current frameworks used by the IMF and the World Bank are not fit for the job. The IMF has been starting to include climate risk, but is all still very tentative. And investment needs, for example, in sustainable development are also crucial to integrate, and climate investments, climate risks need to be fully incorporated in these frameworks. The IMF, and that's a very concrete suggestion, should create an option for all sovereign debtors to request an updated debt sustainability analysis that could then form the basis for negotiations with public and private creditors. There needs to be a much better framework to create legal safeguards for debt restructurings in order to limit opportunities for holdouts, so that private creditors obstruct debt restructuring process, which really should be much quicker than what we've seen over the past decades. Because having a swift debt resolution, of course, will also be important for countries to get on their feet very quickly. So these legal safeguards are critical. One point that is also highly relevant is that we need much better incentives, and indeed also pressure on private creditors to participate in reprofiling and restructuring. What we can't see happen is having public bailouts and then the private creditors get away with this. As I said, the majority of sovereign debt from the global south is held by private creditors, and these need to be brought to the table, and there are various ways, including through financial and legal ways to make that happen. But also incentive schemes such as with the Brady bond restructurings. One important point is also that in much of the debt restructuring, the sovereign debtors from the global south don't get the same voice as others. There are a lot of very important proposals from debtor countries on the table, which have not been listened to by the G7. For example, the V20 countries, which comprise 55 climate vulnerable developing countries, they put forward a proposal for the COP in Glasgow for debt restructuring that would facilitate investments in climate prosperity plans. This has been completely ignored, and we suggest that the G7 should initiate a dialogue not only with the V20, but also other debtor groups. And then last but not least, going forward, new debt issuance should also incorporate climate and sustainability targets. So these should be integrated into public debt management frameworks. With this, I hand over to Tetsushi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uri. So good afternoon from Tokyo. My name is Tetsushi Sonobe. I have two policy briefs to present briefly. Next page, please. The first one is on partnership for staying the course for a sustainable economic recovery in uncertain times. So the policy brief finds that a sustainable and inclusive global economic recovery following the COVID-19 pandemic faces significant unprecedented global challenges which were foreseen during COP26 last November and exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So these challenges reduced already constrained fiscal spaces available for post-pandemic recovery, threaten access to and affordability of clean energy, and impede multilateralism's effectiveness. So these challenges, coupled with difficulties in implementing non-binding international agreements, threatens to derail the great efforts required to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So as proposal to address the challenges, transition to circular economy and the low carbon energy transition need to be achieved across the world. And this in turn requires appropriate technology transfers to the global south. Clear standards, regulation, and incentives frameworks for finance and investment, and the mobilization of private finance. So this policy brief calls on a group of 7 to develop and support international partnerships consisting of public-private organizations and bilateral, multilateral development organizations, as well as national governments and the NGOs. So these partnerships strengthen the global efforts to provide technology, finance, and the institutional infrastructure for accelerating the circularity transition and the energy transition. And the implementation part explains in detail how and what kind of technology transfers are needed and how they should be implemented, and capacity building for the skills engaged in this effort, and the finance schemes and the standards and the regulations and the incentive frameworks, and the energy transition mechanisms, which could be already started in some part of Southeast Asia, but should be scaled up across the world, and the clear standards and the regulatory frameworks will explained in detail. So this is about the first proposed policy brief. Next page, please. So the second one is on building resilient education systems to mitigate the adverse effects of COVID-19 and future disruptions of learning. So not only COVID-19, but also natural disasters and violent conflicts cause prolonged education disruptions. Without a carefully planned scheme to mitigate the impact of these disruptions and recover learning losses, the disruptions will lead to significant scars, permanently lowering lifetime earnings and well-being of individuals, and persistently depressing economic growth. Previous and current disruptions clearly demonstrated the need to build highly resilient education systems. There are many things that central and local governments, schools, and teachers, and those interested in supporting education can do before a disruption occurs. A resilient education system can be prepared to protect students, teachers, and other staffs at school and the school administration organizations and the school infrastructure in the best possible way. The system can continue learning processes in the face of school closures and rapidly recover foregone and lost learning. The G7 and the international organizations can partner with country governments to ensure high education system resilience. So international organizations can play an important role in collecting and sharing good practices about this globally to help governments, schools, and communities. So implementation part include this table. I omitted all the contents, but the table consists of 3 parts, as shown in the yellow lines. So the first is preparedness, which is about implementations in advance. The second is early responses, which will be done during or immediately after the worst period. And then the recovery phase is number 3. So what can be done will depend on the capabilities or effectiveness of government and the local community. So the table has 2 columns, one for high capability environments and the other for low capability environments. And the important item in the preparedness phase is to develop a learning continuity planning. Just as a businesses have a business continuity plan, national and subnational education administration bodies should have a learning continuity plan. The business continuity is firm's ability to continue or rapidly recover business operation up to a predefined level following a disruption. So similarly, learning continuity is the ability of the education system to continue service delivery at predefined acceptable level during disruption, and also help students make up for any learning loss following a disruption. And then the implementation part explain in detail those things that should be done in different phases, and then by a low capability and high capability environments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tetsushi. I think we can end the slideshow, yeah? And I suppose now we have time for questions, comments from all of you. Robert, and do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Ulrich, and everyone here for the presentation and sharing your learnings and knowledge. That's very helpful and supportive. Yeah, I'm Robert Schramm. I'm a coordinator for several transition platforms, and I'm particularly interested in alternative social, economical, and governance models, and that's why I'm here. And I wanted to ask a question to Paola, if she's available. And I think, Ulrich, one of the first slides, you mentioned the proposal that said a workable international adjustment platform is needed, or I couldn't write down the whole sentence because it passed by too quickly, but maybe Paola can respond to it, how she sees this and how would that function. Thank you.
Sorry, Robert, I don't think there is any platform in the presentation. Do you know what it was, this reference?
Yeah, it was, I think, the third slide Ulrich went through before you came in. He was dealing with your part. But if it's, yeah, if you can track it back, we might be able to.
Do you mean a workable international adjustment mechanism for global imbalances?
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, thanks.
Paola, do you?
Yep.
This is
yeah, no, sorry, it's not a platform. It's a mechanism to adjust trade imbalances and exchange rate imbalances. So basically use the exchange rates to adjust the imbalances on the trade side. So I don't think that's a platform. I wouldn't characterize, it's not a platform at all.
No, I think I wrote it down wrongly because it went too fast, but the mechanism, can you expand on it? Yeah.
I'll put in the chat.
Probably, I think probably let's leave it to bilateral because it's a quite technical explanation, and I'm happy to discuss it with you bilaterally, but I prefer not to take much time from the discussion.
Let me just add.
David, sorry, David. No, let's carry on with the discussion. Maybe we can do with Robert bilaterally.
Very good. I look forward to talking, Robert.
Thanks.
further thoughts, ideas, questions? There is a question in the chat for Paola from PR. PR, you can also put the question directly if you want. I don't know who PR is.
Maybe we can read the question aloud and Paola can answer. And after Paul McAllister, he also wanted to raise a question.
Yeah, so the question is from Paula Rem. If Paula doesn't want to, I'll read it out. So, COVID and Ukraine crisis showed all weaknesses of neoliberal capitalism. Private property and freedom of trade are basic values upon which global economic system was founded. However, now private property is being confiscated and the global trade network is shattered. Neoliberal capitalism is destroying itself through sanctions, which is not necessarily a bad thing because neoliberalism was based on exploitation and oppression. Do you think that this needs to be transformed into an opportunity to establish a more socially just system worldwide? That's a rather broad question. Paola?
Yes, the answer is yes, but it's not because of the reasons you put in your question. And so we need a more inclusive growth, and we know we have moved into a much more unequal distribution of resources, and so that's we need policy action to correct this inequality. And obviously we need to strengthen inclusiveness as well. But I don't think it's the reasons in your question are those that suggest that then it's the point is good. I think the implementation probably goes through a different type of actions than the one. I don't even know if there are any action there. But anyway, yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay, I think there was someone else, but I can't see a hand now. But whoever wanted to go next, please speak. Anyone? Oh, everyone's very shy.
Maybe Paul should write his question because we're having technical issue and maybe we don't have in time, but he can write in the chat and we can say it aloud.
Sorry, who wanted to speak or what?
Paul McAllister. Oh,
okay.
There's also Julia True. She can ask her question first.
Thank you very much, Julia Truhl, Oxfam, Germany. Regarding the inequality of the current system, and as Professor Soubaki just said, we need a less unequal system. What if you can recommend just one thing to do now, especially to the G7 governments focusing on the war? If the one thing in our economic system they can change now under these extraordinary circumstances where brave steps are possible, which wouldn't be possible under normal circumstances, what would you recommend them? So if you had the chance to grab Mr. Scholz and Mr. Habeck on the floor while you're there in the same building with them, and if you have one recommendation, what they have to do now, what would it be? Thank you.
Well, it depends what you want to achieve and which are your priorities at the moment.
The inequality bit.
Well, again, where do you want to start? Do you want to, because obviously we need to, there are trade-offs in every policy action. So is it a short term? So at the moment, the big inequality from people who are being suffering from the spillovers of this crisis. So that is a short-term objective, and that means helping them to go through the current crisis. So that could be one thing to be put on the table. It could be a long-term bargain, as we say in our presentation, in our paper. And so that requires, and this is not something that is happening overnight, it requires probably a different distribution system, a distributive mechanism than are implemented through, for example, taxation. So one thing, so there are many different areas where we can operate. There isn't one answer that covers everything. But if I say the priority at the moment is to help those who are struggling through the current situation to get through, because that is an emergency, right? As an emergency for people down the ground where there is conflict, warfare, but also for people who are very much the innocent bystanders as a result of this crisis.
Sorry.
That was clear. It was about the question about how we can, because you answered the question of the former speaker with, yes, we need a new system, unless unequal system, and I just wanted to know how you would change the system. I'm not talking about short-term solutions. I wanted to know what is the most important bit you would do now to change our
but I think she
system into inequality.
I think Paula gave her answer with progressive taxation. I would just like to add that when we talk about equity, there is, of course, the within country dimension, but also the international dimension. And here I would just like to emphasize that we are at a very difficult moment in time, where, of course, also now the already terrible debt situation in many countries in the global south is getting even more difficult because high food and energy prices. I mean, of course, some countries, fossil fuel exporters will benefit, but a large number of developing countries will get an extra whammy because of the current food and energy prices. And so if we talk about equity and then we should also talk about international dimension that would require a very comprehensive approach to debt relief for countries that need it, because otherwise they will have zero chance of achieving sustainable recoveries. And this was supposed to be the decade of action with the 2030 agenda. And of course, if countries are technically bankrupt, they won't be able to invest in anything, and certainly not the Agenda 2030. And I think we'll have to wrap up. I know Mei-Lin has her hand up, so maybe you have Mei-Lin 1 minute, if that's okay.
Yes, I wanted to bring up the whole point about all the digital data that's available, not just in the public sector, but through the tech giants and certainly SAP here in Germany. So much of that data, as Dennis Snower brought up this morning, could actually help fine-tune the progress towards the goals, both in low income as well as developed countries. I think we want to touch on some of that can help achieve the objectives of all three papers that are here. And I just want to bring that up, that my recommendation is that we actually say, let's bring the private sector data into play on this.
All right, thank you. So I think we'll have to wrap up. So I've forgotten your name, Global Solutions Summit 2022. Is that the case now? All right, good. Well then, thanks everyone for their contributions. Sorry about the delay with getting started, but wonderful that Paula could join in the end. And so this is all work in progress. We'll over the next couple of weeks and months, we'll continue working on these things. Reach out if you want to discuss any issues, and thanks a lot for joining today. Bye-bye.